Assalamualaikum listeners. Before we start the show, I wanted to remind you guys of a very, very exclusive offer, which is essentially our Patreon WhatsApp Boys in the Cave chat that, mashallah, like, alhamdulillah, I think it's probably one of the best WhatsApp threads you can be on in history, to be honest, because like the amount of, mashallah, like knowledgeable people that are there, because we do add our guests from the show onto that chat, as well as our very insightful listeners that are Patreon members who are on the chat as well. There's mashallah, very amazing discussions happen. So we have the sort of guests that we do have on the Patreon WhatsApp chat is the likes of Dr. Jonathan Brown, Asadullah Ali, Dr. Samir Mahmood, Tariq Tamar. We also have the likes of, Mohammed Taba, Mohammed Ishaq, and many, many others as well. So you definitely don't want to miss out such an opportunity. So we have even Sheikhs on it, like Sheikh Omar Baloch, Sheikh Osta, for example. So you definitely don't want to miss this opportunity to be in the same chat as such wonderful thinkers and brilliant minds and the sort of discussions that we have. So if you want to be part of the inside conversations, definitely join our Patreon page, $5 Patreon tire. Inshallah, you can join us in the WhatsApp group. So all you have to do is go patreon.com/boysinthecave. It's $5 Patreon tire. And at the same time, you're also benefiting our project to keep on going smoothly, and at the same time also better our production quality, and inshallah we can improve better and then think about going into video, and that can only be done through your help. So inshallah, I hope people jump onto that and look into that, and also at the same time benefit BITC. So thanks for that, and I'll get into the show inshallah. So I hope you enjoy the show. Assalamu alaikum listeners, welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. I'm your co-host Tanzim. I'm joined by my very special co-host Ryma here. And alhamdulillah, we're joined by a very, very special guest, someone who I've been following very intently in various platforms and social medias. So Mustafa Briggs is a graduate of Arabic and International Relations from the University of Westminster, whose dissertation focused on Arabic literature and literacy in West Africa. Started an MA in translation at SOAS with a specialisation in Arabic and Islamic texts before going on to al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt, where he's currently doing another degree in Islamic Studies and Arabic. Rose to international acclaim for his Beyond Bilal Black History in Islam lecture series, which saw him explore and uncover the deep-rooted relationship between Islam and Black history. He has done tours all over the world at universities such as Harvard, Yale, Cambridge and Oxford, and his lecture has been made into a book which will be coming out soon, inshallah. So, Assalamu alaikum, Mustafa, and welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, it's a pleasure to join you guys.
Alhamdulillah. I've actually been, as I mentioned, that I've been following various platforms. I think what came to attention was firstly through it was the podcast, the Baraka Boys podcast that you were doing.
Oh yeah,
where you were just discussing like stuff to do with Deen and Islam, because me and Ryma are based out in Australia, so I guess we aren't fully aware about the whole UK scene, but it's just, I think mashallah I had a big reach with that podcast, where that's when I started kind of looking into each individual characters on that show, and then mashallah I started seeing that you actually tour around the world and do your own lecture series. So what got you into doing the talks around the world, such as the Bilal Beyond Bilal series that you've been doing?
Beyond Bilal, if I tell you I got into that all by accident, literally, it was it was when I was doing my master's degree. So this was 2017, I believe. Yes, because I was supposed to finish 2018. So 2017, there was an interview that took place on BBC Radio, and that's like the national radio in the UK. Well, you all know the BBC. I think it's worldwide now, where it has been. But yeah, and there was a friend of mine called Najwa, and she did an interview on BBC, and the interviewer asked her, because she mentioned being Muslim at the end, towards the end of the interview, and then the interviewer said, "Oh, so you're Muslim?" And then she was like, "Yeah." Like, "Oh, but you're black. Can you be black and Muslim?" And when Twitter got a hold of that, it kind of went crazy, and everyone was talking about it. And so there were a lot of discussions around this whole subject of the experience of Black Muslims. And this was at a time when there were other things going on as well. Black History Month came around, and there was a few YouTube series talking about Black Muslims. It sparked a whole conversation in the UK of Black Muslims feeling marginalized, feeling like they weren't, understood or appreciated, especially within Asian or Arab Muslim communities. And then this led to like a YouTube series which was going on, talking about the experiences of Black Muslims, where everyone was kind of giving anecdotes of their different experiences of navigating being Black and being Muslim. And so it was a discussion, and there was a panel session. So then numerous ISOCs. I don't know, in Australia, do you call it an ISOC or an MSA, the Islamic societies in the universities?
Mostly MSA, but yeah, ISOC as well. There's some societies. We call it both, essentially.
Yeah, because in America they call them MSAs. But the ISOCs, a lot of the ISOCs in the UK started having panel sessions around this topic, being Black and Muslim, etc. And so a friend of mine called Kyle Gray, who was doing his master's in history at SOAS at the time, or he had just finished his master's in SOAS at the time, was invited to talk and be a part of one of these panel sessions. And because we're very close, and obviously he knew that I had been doing research on the history of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa and, Arabic literature and literacy in West Africa, etc., he said, you would be a perfect person for this panel session. So he recommended me it was at King's College, which is part of the University of London. And I joined this panel session. It was me, Kyle, and another brother called Yusuf, who's the head of FOSIS, which is the Federation of Islamic Societies in the UK at all the universities. He's Somali origin, Kyle is Jamaican origin, and I'm West African origin. And so the three of us were on this panel. And so my talk was more, I said, in order for us to talk about our experiences of being Black and Muslim, I'm tired of hearing people complaining about negative experiences, not to invalidate people's experiences or to say that they shouldn't talk about them. It's part of a healthy conversation, but I feel like complaining without offering a solution to the problem is fruitless. And it just makes, I didn't really support that. So I said, for my part of the presentation, what I wanted to talk about was the actual history and the intersection between Black history and Islam, because I feel that racism only takes place within the Muslim community, and Black people feel marginalized within the Muslim community due to actual experiences. But the origin of that is the fact that people are ignorant of the position that Black people hold within Islam historically, in the Quran, in the Islamic texts, etc. And so I brought forth and the contributions of Black Muslims to Islamic society as well. So my small presentation that I presented there at King's College was called Beyond Bilal, Black History in Islam. And I spoke about, the things that I later speak about in the full Beyond Bilal presentation. So from there, somebody from Oxford University was present. So they invited us to redo the panel in Oxford University. So I organized that with them. And so the second university I spoke at was Oxford. And then after they had heard that people had heard that I'd done King's College and Oxford, then I was invited to UCL, University College London, to give another lecture about Islam in West Africa. And then it just kept on rolling from there, really. And then the following year, 2018, as Black History Month was approaching, I contacted a friend of mine called Islam Yassin, who's like an amazing graphic designer. I have to shout him out on the podcast. And I said to him, can you design like a poster and slides for Beyond Bilal, Black History in Islam? Because I was being invited to all these different universities to give lectures in 2017. So I said, I know in 2018, maybe if I just put on my Instagram, okay, I have one lecture, whoever wants to book me can book me, we can arrange it. So he made the poster, I put it on my Instagram, and I was approached by 30 different universities to give lectures at each of their universities. And so I narrowed it down to 20, and I did a 20 university tour in 2018. And that kind of took the internet, I guess, by storm, because that had never been done before. There'd never been an Islamic lecture that has toured universities in that way before, let alone it being about Black history in Islam. And so everyone started talking about it. And then from there, that was in October 2018. Then I was approached by an organization in Nigeria to conduct the same lecture in the Civil Center in Lagos on Victoria Island, by an organization called Tahara Collective. So I did that in December. I went with my close friend Mamadou Tal. And then the following February, because February is Black History Month in America, I have some American followers. So they said to me, will you be able to come to America and do the lecture? So I was booked at one place originally in America. It was a masjid in Ohio. And after I went to Ohio, when I put on my Instagram, I'm coming to America, loads of different universities started approaching me. So it ended up being, I think, an 11 university tour. And that's when I did Harvard, I did Yale, and I did a few of the other major universities. But the first place I actually spoke was at NYU, New York University, in the Islamic Center there. And I was hosted by Imam Suhaib Webb and Imam Khalid Latif. And so, yeah, I began the journey in America there in New York. And then I went to Ohio for the original booking. And then from there, I went to Atlanta, went to Harvard, went to Yale, went to Brown University. I went to Philadelphia University. So I did 4 of the 8 Ivy League universities. And then, yeah. And then it just continued from there. That was February 2019. And then I was invited back to Harvard again in September to take part in a conference around Islam in Africa. I was invited by the head of the Islamic department there, Professor Usman Khan. And so I went with all of my boys from the podcast, Baraka Boys, because he invited us as a collective, the Baraka Boys podcast. And then from there, I did another USA tour. I did another 5 universities or so in that time. And then came back to Egypt, did exams, was chilling. And then following February this year, 2020, I did another UK tour, but it wasn't as big as the first one, 2019 October. And then 2020, I did my USA tour, I can call it my 3rd USA tour. And then I came back to Egypt in March, and then we went into lockdown. And then that's when I started doing all of the lectures online. So I did Beyond Bilal online. I did Before Malcolm X, History of Islam in the Americas online. And that was actually what I was touring with in America this year. I developed that second lecture, The History of Islam in the Americas, for this year. And then I brought out Daughters of Fatima, which was about female scholarship in Islam and specifically in Africa. And then I did one called Land of Mansa Musa, which was about Islamic empires in West Africa. And then my latest one was Africans in Asia, which spoke about the influence of African migrants in pre-colonial subcontinent Asia. So there was a big presence in Pakistan, in Sindh, in Bengal. And so I talk about the Africans there who most of them came in as slaves, and then they ended up becoming princes, commanders of armies, kings, etc. And they left a really big mark on the history of the subcontinent that a lot of people don't know about. So I feel like I've been talking for a long time, but yeah, essentially that's how I got into it, and that's where it's taken me now, alhamdulillah.
That sounds like an incredible journey, and I really can't wait to get into it. I'm really stuck in. So I wanted to kick things off by asking, because I also have a fascination with these kind of topics, and I realize that, Islam, as much as we like to think of it as this comprehensive lifestyle of sorts, it kind of develops into its own expression and character almost, depending on the region and cultures that it's exposed to and that it's operating in. Not that it takes on a different form, but you can definitely, it has an extra flavor to it, I would say.
Yeah.
And coming from North Africa myself, I can definitely see the distinctions between how it's practiced and how it's morphed with the people. So how would you characterize the difference between how Islam is practiced in West Africa or Africa in general in comparison to other regions like the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, etc.?
That's a very deep deep question. Um, when speaking about the manifestation of Islam in Africa in general, you can divide Africa into three main regions. You can divide it into North Africa, which is very detailed within itself because you have Morocco and their experience and their manifestation of Islam is completely different from Algeria and Tunisia, etc. And Egypt, which can be considered North Africa, I guess, as well. And then there's East Africa, where you have, the Swahili coast. Then you have Somalia, you have Habash, which is Ethiopia and Eritrea. And then you have West Africa. And even within West Africa, Nigeria, Gambia, Senegal, Sierra Leone, it's all interconnected, but then all very different. But so I'll focus on the West African region because that's where I come from and where I have the most experience. And I would say the main characteristics of Islam in West Africa, personally for me, I would say is the joy and the joyfulness and the love that people have in practicing Islam and in loving the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and in expressing their love for Allah through many different ways, through dhikr, through singing qasaid, through dedication to memorizing the Quran, through deep intergenerational scholarship. And I would say those are the main factors. And also Islam there is very natural. It's very free flowing. It's very, it's become a deeply embedded part of West African society, especially in the Senegambian region where I come from and where I have the most experience with Islam. I would say, yeah, Senegambian region and northern Nigeria. But I can't speak Hausa, so I won't even claim northern Nigeria like that. But I visit Nigeria a lot. And Islam has been around that region for about 1,000 years. And Islam was spread. And what is interesting with the way Islam was spread in sub-Saharan Africa, in sub-Saharan West Africa specifically, is that it was never colonized. That region was never colonized or controlled by Arabs. So if we look at, for example, the Middle East or North Africa, during the Futuhat, the Islamic conquests during the time of the Khulafa Rashidin, and then in the time of the Umayyads and the Abbasids, these regions all became under Arab control, and so they became Arabized. Because the Khulafa Rashidin were from Quraysh, the Umayyads were Qurayshi Arabs as well, and the Abbasids were Qurayshi Arabs essentially. And so they controlled that region and they Arabized those regions. So you see many people who at once upon a time were probably Phoenicians or Persians or, Amazigh, etc., calling themselves Arab. But in West Africa, because the relationship and how Islam spread was through trade and not, I don't want to call it colonization, but through trade, and not being conquered or controlled by Arabs, Islam, they took the Quran, they took the Sunnah, they took the Islamic scholarship, but they made it very African and it didn't take over or remove their African identity. And so the same ethnic groups and tribes that existed from before Islam still existed after Islam, the same modes of dress, the same cultural expressions, they just became Islamicized. So that as well, I would say, is a very important factor into how Islam was traditionally practiced in West Africa up until, I would say, about the 50s or 60s, when we start to see more influence due to more outside influence affect the practice of Islam in the region due to, globalization and media, etc. But West African Islam is very much African. So I remember my family, for example, are Christian and they're descended from liberated Africans who returned from the Caribbean and from the Americas to West Africa after the slave trade ended. So culturally, our tribe or our ethnic group, the Creole or the Aku, on my mom's side, they wear suits and Western clothing. So anytime, for example, my grandma would make a traditional Senegambian outfit for me, like a Senegalese or Gambian outfit for me, she would call it Muslim clothing. If Muslims in the, I don't know, in the West or in Asia or in the Arab world saw the clothing, they'll just call it, oh, it's African clothing. It's a boo. But for us, the West African traditional clothing was very much the same as Islamic clothing, because that's what Muslims wore, because Islam was seen as the native religion of that region, especially to Creoles, for example, who saw themselves not as natives, but as a tribe or an ethnic group coming in from somewhere else and settling into the Senegambia region. For them, they saw what they saw as West African culture or Senegambian culture was exactly the same to them as Islam. And so anything that was African to them was Muslim. It was the Muslim way of doing things. So I think that shows, I don't know, I hope that answered the question a bit. But I would say that is the main thing, the Africanness of it. The fact that the traditions and the traditional languages and the traditional modes of dress were not changed. And the passion and love that West Africans put into loving Allah, loving the Prophet, especially in Senegambia, as I've mentioned before. Allah and Rasulullah are part of everyday life. They're part of everything. And there's not this concept of, are you a practicing Muslim or not? Even the people who in other contexts would be considered as non-practicing, before they speak, they'll always praise Allah and send salah on the Prophet ﷺ. And even if somebody doesn't pray or somebody doesn't practice in what the term that we would use it, Allah, the consciousness that Allah exists and the consciousness that the Prophet ﷺ is the Prophet ﷺ and his spiritual presence, etc., are all things that are very much firmly established in the psyche of the nation and of the area and of the people. And so it appears again and again in music, in everything, in all aspects of life, Like I remember I was watching a TV show, and it was a show where they go to the houses of like popular singers. So this is like a pop singer, Senegalese pop singer. And it's like a cooking show. So they go to the singer's house, and then the singer will show them how they cook their meals, etc. And so they asked this singer, and she was wearing like a t-shirt, she was cooking, and they said to her, oh, can you start off by singing a song? And so she sings a song, but the song is a song praising the Prophet ﷺ and talking about the martyrdom of Imam Hussein at Karbala. And it's in the local language, Wolof. Anyone that looked at her would think, oh, she's not really practicing, or she doesn't seem like the typical Muslim, but she's somebody that had a deep knowledge of Islamic history, a deep love for the Prophet ﷺ, knowledge of his family, of his Ahl al-Bayt, of what happened in Karbala, which is something a lot of Muslims don't know about. Started singing about the lineage of the Prophet, traced it all the way back to Adnan in this song as she was cooking on national TV, on a show that had nothing to do with Islam or nothing to do with religion. But it's so embedded in the culture, in the society, in the psyche of the people that, a day can't go by without you singing about Allah or talking about Allah or talking about the Prophet. So that's another thing as well that I find very, very deep. And the attachment to poetry, I would say as well, is a big thing. Qasaid, praising the Prophet such as Qasida Burda, Hamziya of Imam Busayri, the Ishriniyat of Al-Fazazi, Dalal al-Khairat, even though it's not a poem, etc., are all things that are very much a part and parcel of West African Islam. And the Diwan of Shaykh Ibrahim Yas, the Qasaid of Shaykh Ahmad Bamba, these are all things that, growing up, you always hear, you always see them being recited, and dhikr, I would say dhikr as well is another thing. Circles of dhikr, circles of remembrance of Allah, and dedication to the Quran. Those are the main aspects of West African Islam, I would say. Not to say that they're exclusive to West Africa, but that's just the where people focus and where people put their passion and their energy.
SubhanAllah, that's so enlightening. And it's just making me think on something that I also wanted to touch on early on as well, because while I was while I was listening to you and very much agreeing with you, especially with how you characterize the differences between the regions of Africa, in particular, like how, a big element of that was that it came through trade. And so it wasn't associated with a kind of conquest or power imbalance, so to speak. And then that led to itself being embedded in the culture. Like as enlightening as it was, I couldn't help but feel like a sense of frustration as to why I'm only hearing or learning about Black history in general within an Islamic context only recently. And really, I wanted to ask, because there is such a rich history of Black Muslims and Islam in Africa, at what point in time do you think it was erased and overtaken by a predominantly Arab and Middle Eastern narrative? Was this like a recent phenomenon, or did this erasure slowly happen over time?
To be honest, okay, I would approach it from two aspects. The first aspect I would say is the historical aspect of the world pre-globalization. Um, and actually, do you know what? Everything I would say is the way we see the world. The world we live in now currently is a world that is formulated, by the Western Eurocentric experience. So the entire world is seen through the lens of, I would say, Europe and America. And Australia, I would say, is an extension of that. And so whenever we look at anything or we experience anything or we kind of think about anything, I mean, just look at the world that we live in, really. Higher education, most of it comes from Western countries. Most people try to go to Western universities. The people that do well in most developing countries are people who had access to international schools or who could study abroad in Western kind of institutions, etc. And so our approach to knowledge and our approach to how we see the world is a very Eurocentric or Westernized approach. And through that, then, if we look at the origins of that, the origins of the way the world outside of the West is seen, is usually through the lens of Orientalism. And the Orientalist scholars, so I'm sure the people who listen to this podcast know what Orientalism is. I won't have the time to explain the concept fully here on this podcast. But essentially, Orientalism was the way that Western scholars, who during the time of colonization actually were looking for ways to justify Western imperialism in the developing world or in the non-Western world, so in Asia and in Africa, etc. They developed this way of seeing the world and categorizing the world called Orientalism. And it's looking at the East, as they would call it, through the lens of the West at that time. And so they saw Asians and they caricatured people of the Asian continent in a particular way, people in the Middle East in a particular way, and people in Africa in a particular way, which most of the time was not accurate and was suited to their own, goals and objectives in their interaction with these areas. And so we see that Western scholars were the ones, I would say, first of all, Africa, for example, and what was happening in Islamic West Africa wouldn't be central to the narrative of Islam in the Middle East, because the Middle East did not really have extensive contact with West Africa. So traveling was difficult, especially crossing the Sahara Desert. It was only really traders and people who, had trade missions there that would cross the Sahara to interact with Africans to know what's going on. So we can't expect people historically in the Middle East, for example, to know about Mansa Musa and the Islamic empires, etc., or even what was happening in Asia, because we have, for example, Islamic civilizations in China, Islamic civilizations in, India, Pakistan, etc. People in the Middle East wouldn't know about that. In Asia as well, they wouldn't know what was happening in Africa, etc., just because of the distance, and there's no global media and there's no, internet. There's no way of you to know really what's happening outside of your own community. And so when Asians and Arabs, etc., grow up, they're not conscious of what was happening in Africa, which is not a fault of theirs. But the people who colonized all these regions, So, for example, if we look at the School of Oriental and African Studies, where I started my master's degree, it was literally made as as an institute to train people who were being posted by the British government in their colonies across the world. So it was called the School of Oriental and African Studies because they teach you about the history of the nations that they had colonized, and you were going to be posted in as an extension or as a tool of the empire or the colonial administration. So the way the Westerners approached Africa and Asia was they wrote down, what they found or what they discovered or what they interpreted Islam or the cultures to be in those regions. And the French colonizers in particular, they developed this kind of theory called Islam Noir. And Islam Noir was the theory that West African Muslims were nominally Muslim and they weren't really Muslim as the Muslims in the Middle East or in North Africa or in Asia were, due to the fact that they were not Arab and they did not speak Arabic as a first language. They didn't bother to fully explore the detailed history of Islam in the region. They didn't really understand the complexities and, everything that was happening in terms of scholarship, in terms of trade routes, in terms of scholarly tribes and communities being formed. And all of this research is research that's happening very recently, I would say in the past 30 to 40 years. There were a few people who did research before that. So for example, John Padden, etc. in northern Nigeria. And they made a few mistakes. But essentially it was something that, because I would say Western scholars didn't really consider Black people in general to be of the same level of intelligence as Asians and as Middle Easterners. And then they thought that their understanding of Islam was probably warped due to the fact that they weren't Arab and they did not speak Arabic as a first language. So for years, they dismissed the study of Islam in Africa or the study of the history of Islam in Africa. And only a few scholars actually took the time and the effort to kind of delve into it and dive further into it. And then now it's coming to light. Everybody's, trying to discover more and uncovering more. And there have been some amazing scholars doing work in the field, such as, Professor Usman Khan, Professor Rudolph Ware, Zachary Wright, and many others. But I would say, I don't know if I want to say the history has been whitewashed or it was just that, yes, the history was whitewashed in some aspect, in terms of the secular aspect, because the Western scholars didn't really give Africa that same consideration as they gave to the Middle East and Asia, number one, which is then reflected in the ideologies of the people who study at these different institutions and graduate from there, because the leading thinkers, the leading intellectuals, the leading political figures of the quote unquote developing world, most of them were products of Western education, studying in schools set up by the British or the French, etc., in their colonies. And then they had higher education in these Western institutions. So the way that they were taught by their professors reflects in the way they think. And so that was how the intellectual circles, etc., thought in their countries. And then on the ground, on the grassroots, people just didn't have access to knowledge just because they did not know. They'd never traveled to Africa. And if you don't travel to Africa and you don't interact with Africans, you would never know about the history of Islam in Africa. So then when all of these communities migrate to Australia or migrate to America or migrate to Europe, they only know about their own history and their own culture. And so that's what they will pass on and that's what they will teach and that's what they will represent. It's only nowadays in our day and age where, as children of immigrants, we're all mixing with each other and trying to find out about each other's heritage and culture and history and doing what the Quran describes as the purpose of Allah making us different tribes and nations. Allah says, وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا, that we made you different tribes and nations in order for you to know each other. Our generation, I would say, is the generation that's actually taking the steps to do that. And so all this knowledge and this history is being uncovered in our generation just because we're the ones that are interested. Like, I'm not sure our parents would have sat down and said, okay, let me interview, my contemporaries, or you guys are saying, yeah, let me interview Mustafa Briggs about the history of Islam in West Africa, our parents probably wouldn't have thought of doing that. You know, my mum would never have sat down and thought, let me interview this Asian man about the history of Islam in Asia, for example. So it's a shift in the way we see the world and the way we want to understand history and understand culture and understand the context of, you know, our ummah as we find it, which is pushing the exposure of this hidden history and changing the narrative. Yeah.
Mashallah, that's a really good breakdown. And I wanted to also ask you a different question where it's related to what you were just discussing, but it takes a different angle, because we all know the sort of racism that does exist in this day and age. But however, what's interesting is that sometimes, I guess talking from my personal perspective, when I first, sort of got into Deen and looking into Islam, like we know, I guess, essentially that we shouldn't be racist, but, subconsciously we do take on racist ideologies and ideas and sort of demonstrate them without knowing it, I guess. And that sort of perpetuates and when it's multiplied by other people that are doing it, the same sort of actions that you're doing, it sort of manifests in society more. And what's interesting is that I remember seeing a 1-minute clip of you discussing about racism that existed in our own scholarship, right? Which is a very touchy subject area for a lot of people at times, because they think that, oh wow, our scholars, whatever they write, since they're scholars, it has to be pure and pristine and everything about it is correct, almost like they're infallible at times.
Mm-hmm.
So what's interesting is that you actually mentioned that, okay, no, there's firstly, there were some, racist statements made by our scholars in the past, and secondly, you also mentioned that they were black, and back in those times, in the past, there were even African scholars that were writing about how Arab scholars weren't taking them seriously, and they were sort of making a plea almost to say that, look, don't reject what I'm saying just because I'm black, for example. So that kind of made me think that, okay, there's a parallel between sort of what we're fighting for in this day and age, and also, I guess, the racism that I guess the African scholars were pushing back on in our own Islamic history. So would you be able to sort of walk us through firstly the context of that time of, if it did happen, and if so, like the sort of what was being said and what was said by African Muslim scholars when it came to pushing back on racism that they saw within their own Islamic tradition?
Okay. Bismillah. All right. That's a deep question and a long question, but essentially, just to summarize, we have developed within the Muslim community, and over the past hundreds of years of scholarship, this kind of, actually, I don't even, no. It's not even a historical thing. I feel like it's a contemporary thing. This whole idea of putting scholars on a pedestal and accepting everything they say as what the Deen says and what Islam says, I feel is a very recent thing, and it's due to lack of knowledge and lack of people studying to a level where they can make distinctions between the Sharia and fiqh. So the Sharia is what Allah himself revealed and the Prophet ﷺ himself established in the religion. And then fiqh is the understanding of that. Fiqh literally means understanding, whereas the Sharia is the actual path. And so there's one Sharia, there's one Deen, but many different scholars have different understandings. So the way Imam Abu Hanifa understood things, for example, is different from the way Imam Malik understood things. And Imam Malik is different from the way Imam Shafi'i understood things, even though Imam Shafi'i was a student of Imam Malik. And so when you study traditionally, you realize that, there's ikhtilaf amongst the ulama, the differences of opinion amongst the ulama. And then also considering the fact that ulama were human beings who made mistakes, and they were also products of their environment. And many of them, unfortunately, even though they had knowledge, they used the knowledge that they had to reinforce certain ideas and ideologies that they themselves held, or their society, for example, held. So, for example, I remember studying a fiqh book, me and my friend Momadou, and I feel like maybe he might have discussed this with you as well. We were studying a fiqh book and it was talking about the aura of a Muslim woman. So what a Muslim woman can and can't show from her body. And then the scholar who wrote this book, it was a Maliki fiqh text. It was an explanation of another Maliki fiqh text even. And this is a scholar from about, I would say, 500 years ago. He's North African. He said, yes, so the woman is required to cover all of her body except her face and her hands. And then he said, unless she's ajuza or soda. He said, unless she's very old or she's black, because nobody finds them attractive, so they don't need to cover their full body or their full etc., their full aura, for example. And so we were like, oh my God, this is racism. And we went to the teacher, and then the teacher was kind of trying to justify it and say, no, that's just what their society found attractive and what they didn't find attractive. If you're da-da-da-da-da. But the problem is that's a fiqh text that, if studied in a different context, could be taken as, oh, this is what the scholar says, so this is what the Sharia says. Do you know what I mean? And so you have these distinctions, and then you see these kind of things. So, for example, even Ibn Khaldun in his Muqaddamah, he says some disparaging comments about sub-Saharan Africans and black people. Traditional, classical Islamic texts, classical Arabic texts, because not all Arabic texts, classical texts, are Islamic texts. They were just texts written by Muslims. So that's another distinction that needs to be made. Some of these fiqh texts, for example, are openly and overtly racist. You see, for example, certain Shafi fiqh texts saying Arabs are superior to non-Arabs in terms of nisbah, in terms of lineage. And so therefore, if, for example, a woman wanted to marry, an Arab woman wanted to marry a non-Arab man, her father has the right to refuse the marriage because he's not kufu for him, like he's not equal to her or equivalent to her. All of these things you find in fiqh texts. Those are the understandings of these scholars and how they interpreted the Sharia. Obviously, we know that goes against the spirit and the letter of the Quran and the Sunnah, but that's how these ulama decided to twist it and justify it. And so then we start to see a backlash from West African scholars against these kind of ideologies. So Ahmad Baba of Timbuktu, who, if you know about Timbuktu or not, I have a video that I did with Ilmvid about the Sankore University. And it was essentially the largest university in Africa at that time, or the university with the largest library. And it was in Timbuktu in Mali. They had over 700,000 manuscripts, and they, taught. The scholars there, mashallah, had mastered all of the sciences, Islamic sciences and secular sciences. And Ahmed Baba was one of the most extraordinary scholars. And there was a raid where the king of Morocco went to war with the empire in Mali. And so they razed Timbuktu, and they captured Ahmed Baba and they sold him into slavery. And so he was taken from Mali to Morocco. But when he arrived in Morocco, people were so impressed with his scholarship that he later became a famous Shaykh there in Morocco. And I think he passed away and was buried there. And so Ahmed Baba, for example, was one of the first people to start writing against this racism, this Arab racism and, Arab superiority complex that people had within Islamic scholarship and within the Muslim world. And in more contemporary times, Sheikh Ahmad Bamba of Senegal and Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, because they included in their books. So Sheikh Ahmad Bamba, for example, his most famous poem, one of his most famous poems, Masalikul Jinan, which was a poetic summary of Ihya Ulumuddin and Khatimatul Tasawwuf, Ihya Ulumuddin of Imam Ghazali, and Khatimatul Tasawwuf of Muhammad Yadali, and Hikam of Ibn Ata'illah. It included all of these books. And essentially he goes through the deen from beginning to end, Islam, Iman, and Ihsan in this book. And so in this book, he said, do not overlook my scholarship, or do not overlook this text because of the fact that I am non-Arab and I am black. He said, because وَلَيْسَ يُوجِبُ سَوَادُ الْجِسْمِ سَفَاهَةُ الْفَتَاةِ أَوْ سُوءُ الْفَهْمِ. He said, because blackness of skin does not obligate safahatul fata, like a childish intellect, or su'ul fahmi, or bad understanding. Because in classical Arabic texts that he had read, sociology texts, history texts, etc., geography texts, etc., Arab scholars were proposing or putting forth these theories that black people were of lower intellect and lower intellectual capacity than Arabs and Asians and Middle Eastern people. And so this was something that you can see common in classical Arabic literature. Like anyone who studies, because to be an Islamic scholar, you don't just study Islamic texts, you study geography, you study history, you study even Jahili poetry, poetry from before the time of the Prophet ﷺ, to understand Ma'rifatu Kalam al-Arab, like how the Arabs used to speak, so that you better be able to understand the Quran because it was revealed in that context, etc. And so Shaykh Ahmad Bamba, as a scholar who had mastered the Arabic language and mastered all of these works, had seen these racist comments in these works. And so he was trying to refute that. And Shaykh Ibrahim Yas also as well, who came a couple of years after him, he quotes this poem in his first poem, Ruh al-Adab, and he quotes it line for line. He says, وَقَالَ فِي ذَاكَ الْمَجَالِ الْأَمْجَدُ خديم الطه المالكي أحمد فليس يجب السواد الجسم صفاة الفتاة وسوء الفهم. He said, and so it was said about this topic by the servant of the Prophet ﷺ, the Maliki scholar Ahmad, meaning Ahmad Bamba, and then he quotes and he quotes the same verse of poetry. So we can see that this was something that was always present in Islamic scholarship, this racism, even to the point that we see, for example, Jalaluddin Suyuti and Ibn Jawzi, some of our major scholars in the 15th century, writing books in defense of black people. So we have Tanwir al-Khabbash, Fi Fadl al-Sudan wal-Habbash, which is illuminating the darkness concerning the excellence of black people and Habashis, East Africans, specifically, because those were the ones that had the most contact with the Arab world at that time, especially during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And Jalaluddin Suyuti had another book. I forgot what his book was called, but essentially the two of them were aware of the racism in society and within scholarship, because scholars were writing books for scholars. They weren't writing books for lay people. And so all of these things were things that were present, and the scholars were fighting back. Jalaluddin Suyuti, we see, and Ibn Jawzi in their time, Sheikh Ahmed Baba, Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, Sheikh Ibrahim Yas also in their time as well. And in terms of how we should look at this classical scholarship, I think we should just see it the way Imam Abu Hanifa saw it. Imam Abu Hanifa once, he was asked about, how we should take the statements of different scholars. And so he said, anything that comes from Allah, we take it and we don't say anything about it. That's the Quran. Anything that comes from the Prophet ﷺ, ala ayni wa ras, like it's upon our eyes and our heads, meaning we have to obey it. So that's the Quran and the Sunnah. He said, then anything that comes from the Sahaba or the Salaf, we choose what we want from what they have said. So we choose from their own opinions. He said, and anyone other than them, وَهُمْ رِجَالٌ وَنَحْنُ رِجَالٌ. He said, they are men and we are men. Meaning the way they see things and they interpret things is just as credible as the way we see it and we interpret it. So anything outside of the Quran and the Sunnah and the Sahaba, and some people can extend that to the Salaf, and we don't see these racist statements from the Quran or from the Sunnah or from the Salaf for the most part. But it's always scholars who come after them who interpret that according to their own desires, according to their own, racist ideologies, according to their, socio-political context. Then that's where we see these statements. And so I feel like it's important for us to, in this day and age, which is, more knowledge is available to us, more information is available to us, and we are less racist and we're more tolerant and more knowledgeable about other cultures and other societies, to return to the original spirit and letter of the Quran وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَرَّفُوا, and realize that ta'rif is not knowledge, it's experiential knowledge, meaning you have to interact with other cultures, other tribes, other nations, mix with them on a deeper level, not just on an intellectual level, in order to remove all of these kind of prejudices and these ideologies and these ways of thinking, in order for us to become the one nation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted us to be in the beginning.
SubhanAllah. That kind of reminds me, like, even in, I think, The Alchemy of Happiness, Imam Ghazali sort of talks about how people define knowledge as to what they've sort of experienced, as in the sort of knowledge that they've accustomed to or they've been taught, they deem that to be truth. And so essentially he kind of goes into like actual truth or experience. If you want to achieve that level of truth, you sort of have to empty out at times the knowledge, the existing knowledge that you do have, which you may have deemed to be ultimate truth beforehand. And he kind of gives an analogy of essentially, I think it was a pond of water, where if you have to sort of empty out the water and the mud from it, and then embrace, I guess, and then dig up the ground in order to get that pristine, clear water from beneath. So kind of alluding to what you were just saying, that, you know, it's not all about, essentially, at times we deem Islam to be the fiqh at times, if that makes sense, whereas Islam is a lot more than that. And Imam Ghazali sort of talks about experience and how, I guess, the experience of the prophets, or, you know, Dhawq, Kashf, that sort of line of thinking, that's where it sort of lies, instead of just being defined by the actual just rules and regulations at times, which is gold. I think he gives the example of a philosopher's stone and a gold. He says, like, yeah, there's gold there, but, you know, we're aiming for the philosopher's stone in that sense. So that was just kind of adding to what you were just mentioning, that sometimes we're just dictated. The fiqh may have been racist at times. It's about emptying that out and really taking on the actual sort of truth. But I also wanted to ask as well, essentially, you mentioned, you were alluding to the racism that existed in the books as well, but do you know of any instances, for example, where African scholars may have, actually, to be honest, like, because of Timbuktu, I assume that a lot of people all over the world were going there to study, because it was a huge place for knowledge. But at times, if, for example, an African scholar went to study in an Arab country back in centuries ago, would you say that they did experience blatant racism? Because the one that you sort of pointed to in the books may have been, it is still blatant racism, but not from an experiential perspective. But I'm talking about African scholars going to study with other, Arab Muslim scholars, and sort of, I guess, studying together. Was there sort of more blatant racism as well, even in those circles?
So in terms of African scholars, I mean, you hardly ever find traditionally sub-Saharan African scholars leaving sub-Saharan Africa to study in the Arab world or in the Middle East. Usually the way knowledge was transferred were people who would travel for Hajj or Umrah, etc., would bring back books, and then the books will be studied in West Africa and taught by West African scholars. Or if Arab scholars were brought in. So, for example, Jalaluddin Suyuti, a lot of his books were brought back during the time of Askia Muhammad Ture, who was the emperor of the Songhai Empire. He attended classes, some say, with Jalaluddin Suyuti. Others say they just met and he gave him his books. Amongst them was Tafsir al-Jalalain, which was his tafsir that he had completed. It was the tafsir of him and his teacher, Jalaluddin al-Mahali. And that book was then brought back to West Africa and it was taught in West Africa. But you hardly ever see West African scholars leaving West Africa to study in the Arab world until the 60s, which is very recent. Or you see it, for example, Senegal going to study in Mauritania. Mauritania is a West African country, but the ulama there are Arab origin, and they're still Arab, and it's considered an Arab country. It's not considered an African country, even though those two terms are not mutually exclusive. But that's another topic for another podcast, I guess. So in terms of historically, I mean, I can't really tell you any anecdotes. I've seen, for example, in the story of one of the scholars, Sheikh Omar Fouti, who this was about 200 years ago. So Ahmad Baba obviously spoke about racist encounters. He was about, I would say, 500, 600 years ago. But he doesn't really give any anecdotes of him, according to my knowledge. I'm sure they do exist, but from what I've read, I haven't seen any blatant stories about him dealing with racism or how he overcame it, etc. But for example, we see Sheikh Omar Fouti going to Saudi Arabia, well, what is now known as Saudi Arabia, but it wasn't called Saudi Arabia then, the Hijaz. And he stops over in Cairo, and then he spends 2 years in Mecca and Medina with his Sheikh Muhammad Ali, who was from Morocco. And then he returns to West Africa. So let's say he spent just over 2 years in the Middle East or in the Arab world. During that time, he stopped off in Egypt, I believe, and he received some racism there. And then there's some kind of story about him saying something like, if you don't love and respect black, the color, or my skin color as being black, then, the ink of the Quran is black, and the Kaaba that we circumambulate around is covered with a black cloth, and you go around the Kaaba and then you kiss the black stone. He said something like that. Sheikh Ahmad Bamba, as I mentioned earlier, writing about racism in his book, I feel it's not just what he studied in the books, but he also went to Mauritania to study. And one of his biographers, I believe his name is Sheikh Anta Babu, who wrote a book about his life, alludes to the fact that he believes that when Sheikh Ahmad Bamba was in Mauritania, he experienced racism at the hands of the Mauritanian Arab scholars there. And we know Mauritania is a country that, slavery still exists. It was only outlawed recently, and all of these things. And there is a very big divide between the Beydan, the white Mauritanians, the white Arab Mauritanians, and the Haratin, who were the enslaved black African Mauritanians, and also the West African tribes, such as the Sanunke and the Wolof, etc., who live in Mauritania. Because Mauritania is a country where I feel only 30 to 40% of the population is actually white Arab, like Beydan, but they completely control the political scene, they completely control the economy, and most of the ulama, the scholars, had come from that class. And so racism is a big problem there. And I feel like Sheikh Ahmad Bamba, when he went there, he experienced some of that racism, which was what inspired him to come back to Senegal. And when he wrote that poem, include that verse. Because those were probably things that he heard from Arab scholars there, or he was taught by Arab scholars there, that he wanted to refute. And Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, who reiterated that same statement, I feel he's one of the greatest testimonies to this resistance to Arab racism within Islamic scholarship, just for the fact that, number one, he was the first Senegalese scholar, probably after Sheikh Ahmad Bamba, to have white Mauritanian students who are utterly and completely devoted to him. Like, you hear some amazing stories of, the love that they have for Sheikh Ibrahim, the devotion that they have, and the service that they used to render him. So, for example, we see tribes of scholars who had mastered the Sharia, who were descendants of the Prophet ﷺ, who could trace their lineage either through Imam Hassan, the son of Ali ibn Abi Talib, or Zainab, who was the daughter of Fatima and Ali ibn Abi Talib. The different tribes, the Zainabiyin, one tribe, and Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse's first Mauritanian student, Muhammadul Nahwi, is a descendant of Sayyidah Zainab. So he's a Sharif through Sayyidah Zainab. And then we have others like Shaykhani, who was descended from Imam Hassan. And they were descendants of the Prophet, essentially, and ulama, but they were coming to Senegal and working on the fields and for free to give service to their Shaykh in order to study from him, with him, and gain his barakah. And then also the influence he had in the Arab world, being an advisor to President Gamal Abdel Nasser, being an advisor to King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, being the vice president of the Muslim World League, being a member of the Islamic Council by appointment of Hajj Amin Husseini, who was the Mufti of Philistine, Mufti of Jerusalem at that time. He was a symbol of not only the excellence of West African scholarship, but the fact that it's only, through that knowledge and through his personality, he was able to overcome the racism at the time. And he experienced racism when for example, in Egypt, some of the scholars would complain. They say, we've been here, we're the scholars of al-Azhar, we're the scholars of Egypt, but anytime this black African guy comes, Gamal Abdel Nasser always takes his opinion over ours and puts him in on top of us. And, there are different anecdotes, etc., of how he dealt with those kind of situations. But I don't think I have enough time to go through all of them. But yeah, so you do see examples, but generally it's very rare to find West African scholars going to the Arab world to study before the 20th century anyway. So in order to find kind of anecdotes of them going there, traveling to study and then facing racism, it will be very, very difficult because that is a very recent phenomenon. So there's loads of examples I can provide you from recent times, scholars that I've met who studied in Egypt or in Morocco in the 60s, or in Saudi or Qatar, etc., or Iran in the 60s, 70s, 80s, who can give you kind of stories about that and the racism they faced and how they overcame it. But in terms of traditionally, West African scholars usually just studied in West Africa. And I'll end that question with a quote from Shaykh Ibrahim Yas, who in 1937, he was invited to a gathering when he went on Hajj with the King of Saudi Arabia and a few of the ulama that were present on Hajj that year. And in that meeting, after he gave his speech, someone came to interview him. Or this was another meeting even. It might not have been that same meeting, but he mentions an interview that an Arab journalist did with him. And so the Arab journalist said to him, so I'm sure you studied somewhere here in the Arab world, or you are, a graduate of Azhar or something. And the Sheikh said, no, everything I learned in the village in Senegal with my father. And then he said, okay, but I'm sure your father must have studied here in the Arab world with us. And he said, no, everything my father learned, he learned in his village with his father. And so the man said, well, maybe your grandfather then studied here in the Arab world. And he said, no. He said, don't you realize that the light of the Prophet ﷺ can be found anywhere and everywhere?
Subhanallah. Wow. That is the best burn I've heard in a long time, I must say. That was immaculate. But going back, and while listening to all of this as well, it's pretty clear that the main cause, at least within this context of Islamic scholarship and the way that our tradition has been narrated historically, is rooted within the Arab superiority complex that you've touched on earlier. And it's manifested itself traditionally as well as contemporarily as well. When we're talking about, recent migrations, post-colonialism, Muslim communities, intermingling, sharing knowledge, establishing themselves and their institutions.
Mm-hmm.
But what's become very clear, especially within the West itself, is that even though this is happening and now we're having exposure to multiple Muslim communities expressed within the West, the institutions themselves are still rooted and based on an Arab superiority complex, depending on who is establishing our mosques, our schools, our colleges and learning facilities, to childcare and whatnot. It is very much still operating within a Middle Eastern lens, to the exclusion of all others, to which those communities either have to tap in or they have to acquiesce to that lens, as opposed to dismantling it entirely.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, as much as I don't want to keep it superficial, I feel like this whole podcast is just going to be a series of deep questions, because I really don't want to um, misplace the importance of it. So
Mm-hmm.
essentially, this sounds like it's a bigger question of, well, where did racism originate? How did it come about beyond just something corrupt happening within our nature? But I feel this is very much pertinent to the context of Arabs themselves. So, big question for me, and I also don't have the answer to this, and it's fine if you don't as well. I think this is something that we have to collectively unpack together as an ummah. But what would you say would be the origins of this complex and how it continues to manifest itself based on what you've seen and your experiences, either historically or contemporarily in this case?
So you asking racism in general or the Arab superiority complex within the Muslim world specifically?
Specifically, the Arab superiority complex, because racism in general is just that is so massive, and I don't think we would have enough time for this podcast to even canvass it as much as I'd love to do that.
Okay, so generally, I feel as though the Arab superiority complex comes from within the Muslim world. Historically, I would say the Bani Umayyah, so the Umayyad Khilafah, because that's the time we start to see the expansion of the Muslim world. Muslims, the Khulafa Rashidin under Sayyidina Umar and then Sayyidina Uthman, expanding into non-Muslim territories and then taking over rule in those areas. And then we start to see non-Muslims coming into Islam in droves. When that happens, the non-Muslims start to overtake the Arabs when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to studying, when it comes to... So if we look at all of our major scholars, for example, a lot of them are of Persian origin, or a lot of them are of non-Arab origin. The people who founded the science of Arabic language were non-Arabs, and the people who excelled in the science of Arabic language were non-Arabs, because they had to take on this language as a second language, and so they wanted to study it and understand it properly. There was an anecdote that Shaykh Ibrahim Yas quoted in one of his books, where he was there were two tabi'een, I believe, speaking, and they said, "Oh, who is the most excellent person in this science?" And they said, "Oh, it's so and so, and he's a non-Arab." "And who's the most excellent in this science?" And they said, "Oh, it's so and so, and he's a non-Arab," etc. And so in order for the Arabs to be able to continue to dominate and maintain their power, they had to create this narrative of Arab superiority. And so we see a lot of hadith being fabricated. We see a lot of authentic hadith being taken out of context, etc. So for example, the Prophet ﷺ there was a hadith narrated that the Prophet ﷺ said, from the entire creation, Allah chose the children of Nuh, and from the children of Nuh, He chose the children of Ibrahim, and from the children of Ibrahim, He chose Bani Adnan, and from Bani Adnan, He chose the Quraysh, and from Quraysh, He chose Bani Hashim, and from Bani Hashim, He chose me. So Ana Mukhtar min, something like that. So I'm the chosen one from the chosen one from the chosen one. So the Arabs then took this hadith and said, well, this means that therefore the Arabs are superior to all non-Arabs, because if the Prophet ﷺ is the best of creation and he's been chosen from amongst the best, from amongst this, and they use this hadith then to reinforce Arab superiority, or they create hadith or they falsify hadith. That's in a historical context. And so then that's what we start to see, for example, when the schools of fiqh develop, we see opinions forming, specifically in the Shafi'i school, because Imam Shafi'i was a Qurayshi Arab. The other, Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, were not from Quraysh, but Imam Shafi'i was from Quraysh. And so we start to see within his school, there's this ideology developing of the Quraysh are the best of Arabs and the Arabs are the best of all, nations when it comes to nisbah, because they're the closest to the Prophet ﷺ. So therefore, non-Arabs, an Arab father has the right to refuse as I mentioned earlier, his children from marrying non-Arabs because they're not kufu, they're not like equivalent in status to them, etc. And so that's in the early days of Islam. That's literally just coming out of the Salaf al-Salih. Imam Malik met some tabi'een, so he's considered tabi'een, and he's the teacher of Imam Shafi. I'm not sure if Imam Shafi met some tabi'een or not, whether he would be considered as part of the Salaf or not. But we start to see this happening from as far back as then. And, the Bani Umayyah and then the Bani Abbas, exercising or trying to demonstrate their superiority over this vast territory of non-Arabs who are now under their rule, etc. If you teach people the religion in a way that places these people above you, then it won't disrupt the status quo. And the ulama who were, following these governments or being paid by these governments or being supported by these governments or were scared of being oppressed by these governments, also, collaborate with them to develop these ideologies and insert them into the deen and the way the deen is being taught and the way the deen is being spread. And so, I feel like that's the origin of it historically. And then also within a more recent context, I would say the fact that Arabs are Arab and the Quran is in Arabic and the Ahadith are in Arabic, naturally people associate the deen to being an Arab religion. And unfortunately, due to colonization. So, for example, in West Africa, the language of academia before colonization, the main language of academia in a lot of West African countries, such as the Gambia, such as Senegal, such as Mali, such as Sierra Leone, such as Guinea, such as northern Nigeria, was Arabic. But when colonization comes in, so for example, no one can come and test a classically trained West African scholar on his deen or put him in an inferior position because he knows what he's meant to know, and he has mastered the Arabic language. So no Arab can come and say, I'm going to teach you your deen, because he knows what he needs to know from the deen. Whereas when colonization comes in and the traditional schools are abandoned for modern French and English schools, and we see, for example, the ulama's grandchildren now not being able to speak proper Arabic, or their relatives. So, for example, Shaykh Ibrahim Niass, who I mentioned, speaks amazing Arabic, mastered the Arabic language. I know some of his grandchildren who cannot speak Arabic and who don't have that same level of scholarship, but they speak fluent English or they speak fluent French because they grew up in a context where they went to French school or they went to English school. And so they put more emphasis on that than on the classical Arabic language. So then when those people migrate to new communities where there are Arabs present, who the Quran is meant to be in their language, even though a lot of Arabs don't actually know Fusha Arabic, they can play this kind of, well, let me teach you how to do wudu, or let me teach you your deen. Or many times, I've entered a mosque and you see that the masjid uncles who, I don't know, I speak Arabic, I understand the Quran, let me teach you, etc., because you clearly might not know. That mentality seeps across. So in a historical context, it was that. And then in a more contemporary context, I feel it's unfortunately through colonization, many of the Muslim communities don't have the same dedication to the Quran, mastery of Arabic, mastery of knowledge as their grandparents or great-grandparents probably did. And so they're put into an inferior position in a new country, in a Muslim community, because there are people who are Arab who feel they have more right to the Quran and more right to interpret the Quran and lead the communities than people who can't, read the Quran in its original language.
Wow. That is very apt and very important observations to be made, because then that leads me to my next question, in that in order for us to move forward and address the problem, it's really important to articulate the source of the problem to begin with and identify it, because at least we know what we're up against. And it's very clear that there has been such a misappropriation of the deen, as you said, to justify a cultural understanding of race that is essentially happening to the detriment of anyone who isn't Arab, let alone for the communities who are Black themselves. So moving forward, how do we revive our traditions in a way that removes this internalized racism within these structures, either within Islamic scholarship or within our communities themselves.
So would you say the question is, sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes. How would we revive our traditions in a way that removes this internalized racism? So either within Islamic scholarship or within our communities, so that way this is not a problem in the future. I understand this is probably a long-term answer, but yeah, it's something that we need to. I feel like we all need to discuss in depth.
Okay, I would say just investing in a new generation of scholars and scholarship that are going to reinterpret the tradition in a way that matches our context now and are doing the work. So, for example, I wouldn't put myself forward as one of those scholars, but like things like my Beyond Bilal project, for example, I was able to reach tens of thousands of people through this, young people, because I was giving the lecture in universities. And even though, the older generation is important and they do show a lot of love and support and they do attend the lectures, the overwhelming majority of people who attended my lectures were young people. So if you calculate it, for example, say I went to 40 or 50 universities across the world, and in each university, so say 40 universities, for example, and each lecture I would say is about 100 to 200 people. If it's 200 people per lecture, that's 8,000 people. Not to talk of the people who saw it online, who, follow me on Instagram, 22,000 people, etc. So these are all people whose mentalities, I feel, if they absorb the lecture properly, have changed or will change. And they will go on to teach their siblings, teach their friends, teach their children, or raise their children in a different way. And there are many scholars who are doing amazing work like this. So people like, for example, Rudolf Ware, people like Professor Sheikh Mohammed Adeyinka Mendes, who's commissioning a major project, to change the narrative within Islamic scholarship, especially when it comes to Black history in Islam. People such as Sheikh Aisha Prime. There are a number of scholars, Habib Akande, who I consider, an older brother, who was one of the first people to ever write a book about this subject in English and, start to raise awareness of this information at a time when not many people knew about it. And people before him, such as Abdullah Hakim Quick, who I was honored to meet in Toronto and who passed me on some, important documents and books, etc., and, prayed for the success of my mission, which he saw as the continuation of his mission to enlighten people on, Islamic history, especially when it comes to the context of Black Muslims. All of these people exist and all these people are doing amazing work. And I feel like knowledge is the only way we can remove these ideologies. For example, when Ibrahim made dua for the Prophet ﷺ to come to the Ummah, he prayed for a Prophet ﷺ. He prayed for a prophet that would come and teach people, so recite to people the verses of the Quran or the verses of the book and purify them and teach them the book and the wisdom and teach them the book and the wisdom. And so Allah responds in another verse and said, لَقَدْ مَنَّ Allah has blessed us by sending to us a Prophet ﷺ who recites to us the verses of the book and who purifies us and who teaches us the book and the wisdom. So the knowledge and the wisdom and the recitation of the Quran and the verses are all meant to purify us. So it's only through knowledge that we can be purified of these base attributes, such as racism, such as pride, such as jealousy, etc. We zakihim, like that's one of the missions of the Prophet ﷺ, and he does it through the Quran, which is a recitation. And the first word revealed from the Quran is Iqra, read. And the Prophet ﷺ, from everything he was given, all of the gifts he was given, the only time he was ever asked to increase in something or to ask Allah to increase in something was when Allah said to him, Qul Rabbi zidni ilman. Say, Oh Allah, oh my Lord, increase me in knowledge. So I feel knowledge is the only cure for this. If people had knowledge of the facts and the history of the context of the Quran. For example, the colors of certain major prophets that we have in the Quran, such as Adam and Musa being described by the Prophet ﷺ or by the Mufassirin as being black. If we had knowledge of history to know, for example, that the father of Omar bin al-Khattab was more Ethiopian than Bilal, because Bilal's father, Rabah, was Arab and his mother was Ethiopian. But Omar bin al-Khattab's father, al-Khattab bin Nufail bin Abdul Uzza, was 3/4 Ethiopian. His mother was Ethiopian and his father was half Ethiopian, half Arab. If people knew that, they would see things in a different way than they do now. And many other such facts that come up in my book and in the research of all of these other scholars as well. So I feel like the only real thing we can do is to educate ourselves and spread the knowledge. And that would then hopefully encourage us to change. And if it doesn't encourage us to change, the next generation will definitely see things and interact with things completely differently from the way we do, because we are already completely different from our parents' generation. And so the generation to come, who will be born in a time when all of these things exist, that will be born in a time where they can YouTube Mustafa Briggs and listen to my lectures, or they can buy my book that had already been published, or they can look at the research of all these scholars, which is knowledge that we only are recently being given access to. I feel like then their world will be a completely different world from us, and the way that they see things and the way that they interpret things will be completely different from the way we do. And so to build up ourselves and build resources that will be available for the future generations, inshallah, is what would solve the problem, according to my understanding.
Just to ask a question before we get into some more historical way of I wanted to also ask you later about Islam in Senegal, for example, specifically. But before we go into that, I also wanted to ask, because in your lecture series Beyond Bilal, it's interesting that you talk about important prophets and figures who were black. So, for example, Adam alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam, Isa alayhi salam, etc., and Hajar as well. I wanted to ask, how unaware would you say the Muslim community as a whole is when it comes to such important prophets being black?
I would say a lot of people are completely ignorant. Like, when I give this information, so many people had never heard of it before. If they have heard of it, it's people don't know. And it's, as well, a big part of it is like the whitewashing of history. And even media, subconsciously, there's so many things that we see through the media. So, for example, even though we're Muslim, we grow up and we see films like The Prince of Egypt, or we see films like The Ten Commandments, or we see films like, The Flood of Noah, which were made in Hollywood by Western companies who pick white, Caucasian, Anglo-Saxon actors to play these historical Bible figures who, on the most part, were black and Middle Eastern and dark skin, and completely not, like, if you take someone like Gene Simmons and put them in the Sahara Desert with no sunscreen, they will burn. So how can, you be playing these figures, these historical figures who lived in these regions? It doesn't make sense. And so us growing up seeing that, even something as subtle as The Message, we all grew up as Muslims watching this movie, The Message, and the only visibly black characters in The Message were Bilal and Wahshi. Whereas in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there were hundreds of black Sahaba living with the Prophet ﷺ, on top of the fact that many of his relatives and the people in his own family were described as having the exact same skin tone or darker as the people who we would be known to be as black. So, for example, as I mentioned, Umar bin al-Khattab's father was 3/4 Ethiopian. Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet ﷺ, was described by Imam al-Zahabi in his Tarikh, and by Imam Suyuti in his Tarikh al-Khulafa, as being Adam Shadid al-Udma, like very, very dark-skinned. And so in the movies, in the NBC Omar series, or in The Message, we would never see that. And so I feel like many people are not aware of this information. And then also subtly through media, the history has been whitewashed. So it's like, it's completely acceptable for you to imagine Umar bin al-Khattab looking like a Caucasian, but him looking like a black person is like, oh my God, no, astaghfirullah, no, that's not true. He was Arab, etc. So I feel like all of those things play into it.
Yeah, for sure. Because even when I was watching the message, it was just like, yeah, Bilal radiallahu anhu is black, and it just felt that they just seem a bit out of place. It's like the norm is more, Arab, white skin, etc. What we sort of view it today, and they just seemed out of place. Whereas I assume, as you just articulated as well, in the actual time, during the time of Rasul, there would have been like, it's a more common everyday thing. Like it's more of the norm in society rather than how it was portrayed in the message.
Not only that, but the original Arabs were much darker than the people who we consider to be Arabs today. Because many of the people who we look at as Arabs are Arabized people, but they're not actually Arab. So if we look at, for example, Lebanese people, Syrian people, etc., they were Phoenician before they became Arabized, started speaking Arabic, and then became Arab. But if you look at them genetically, very few of them come from actual Arab tribes. And so that is across the Middle East, people whose ancestors were Persian, whose ancestors were Turkish, whose ancestors were Caucasian, whose ancestors were, like we see, for example, even if you just look at recent history, you can look at like Muhammad Ali, for example, who was the last king of Egypt. His grandparents or his great-grandparents were Turkish or Albanian, but all of these people became Arabized. And so he's the king of Egypt. He speaks Arabic. He can't speak Turkish or Albanian, or if he can, that's probably a second or third language. But somebody coming from the outside looking at him would say, oh, this person is Arab, when they're not. And that's thousands of people in the Arab world. That's the case with thousands of people in the Arab world. So I don't know if you remember, for example, there was an imam on Mecca, and he was a black imam, and he kind of went viral a couple of years ago. And many people in many different, I can't remember his name, I think it was Kalbani or something, Imam Kalbani, but he was one of the imams in the Haram in Mecca, and he was very, very dark-skinned. He was a black man. And so a lot of different articles were written about him saying that he was the son of African migrants, when really he was actually from an Arab tribe, and he's 100% Arab, but he's just very, very dark-skinned. He's a black man, like a visit, like he's darker than me. But that's because the original Arabs, a lot of them were that color. They were lighter-skinned Arabs and they were darker-skinned Arabs, etc. But essentially, blackness and dark skin was a part of that society before, the different mixes and different things started to happen. But yeah, all of that, so those Bilal and Wahshi looking figures looking out of place in that society, they wouldn't have been as out of place as we would have thought, or as they would have looked in the movie. So all of those things kind of play on our psyche and our psychology.
I also wanted to ask as well, because we know, as you articulate, and if we look into the text, our scholars did articulate the fact that our certain prophets were black, and they weren't afraid to talk about that and describe that, and you talk about in your lecture series. But I also wanted to ask, I don't know if you've encountered this, but in, let's just say, the Christian or even the Jewish tradition, or in their scriptures, have you found that they have articulated their, this, because we're all biblical, or what do you call it, Christian Judaic tradition, so we have overlapping prophets essentially. So for example, I don't know if the Christians have described Adam alayhi salam to be black as well, or if, I don't know, the Jews have done the same, or even Musa alayhi salam, I don't know, in the Christian tradition has been talked about to be black. Have you found that to be the case, or have they also potentially whitewashed their own prophets as well?
I mean, the Judeo-Christian tradition has definitely been whitewashed. Anyone who has access to a church and can see images of Jesus knows that, they've whitewashed the history, and they've made them look a certain way and fit a certain aesthetic. But what's interesting is that we see, for example, in the older, more orthodox depictions of Jesus and Mary and different prophets, especially in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and in different churches, we can see that they're visibly darker skinned. or more darker skinned than later images depict them to be. And different movements within the Judeo-Christian tradition kind of sought to reinterpret Bible texts. So we see, for example, in the book of Revelations, Jesus is described as coming back in the day of judgment, and he is described as having feet the color of brass and hair like sheep's wool. So he has very curly hair and he has very brown, dark brown skin. All of these are allusions that we see in the Bible, but if you study the Judeo-Christian context, Judeo-Christian tradition from, its most popular manifestation, you won't really see that narrative there. But in alternate interpretations of the texts, you will see them highlighting that. But it's something that I would not be comfortable in talking about just because I haven't fully researched that tradition to the extent that I've researched the Islamic tradition to know how the narrative is on that side. But that's something that I'm definitely going to look into now, actually, now that you've mentioned it. Yeah, I'm going to start researching that as well and add that to the repertoire, inshallah.
Inshallah, we'll look forward to your takes, because if your lecture series and everything that you've done is anything to go by, I'm sure it will be completely immersive, and we'll all just benefit. We'll have much to gain from it. You touched on at the beginning earlier, actually, speaking of your lecture series, that you actually do run one based on more like focusing rather on female scholarship. And at least to me, a difference has been made very clear in the impact of female scholarship in the region. Personally speaking, for me in North Africa, seeing historically from Cairo in Tunisia to Fatima al-Fihriya in modern day Morocco. And interestingly, this has also manifested itself with the increased participation of Muslim women in various revolutionary movements across the continent. So I wanted to get your thoughts on the significance of female scholarship in Africa and how it manifested itself historically.
This is a very interesting topic for me, and a topic that's kind of close to my heart. And I did, as you mentioned, a whole lecture series about it, and I wrote an article as well for Sacred Footsteps about this specific topic. And at the end of the article, after I highlighted the stories of a few female scholars in West Africa, I said that the lives of these women are but a small example of and a testament to the important role that female scholarship and sainthood has played in the African Islamic tradition. And their accomplishments have not just been limited to the religious sphere, but have instead made these women respected community leaders and social activists who form the backbone of their societies in a manifest way, which is a refreshing alternative to the commonly narrated stereotypes attributed to Muslim women in traditional societies, and serves as an inspiring blueprint for Muslim communities the world over. And when we speak about Islamic scholarship, I mean, in Africa, we'll look at Africa as a continent. So we'll include North Africa and West Africa in this, because it starts in North Africa and then trickles down into West Africa. But we see, for example, here in Egypt, where I am currently, Sayyidah Nafisa, who is the daughter of Hassan al-Anwar, who is the grandson of Hassan ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib. So she's a descendant of Imam Hassan, and through Imam Hassan, a descendant of the Prophet ﷺ. She was one of the major scholars of Egypt in her time. She migrated from Medina Munawwara to Egypt, and she was the teacher of Imam al-Shafi'i. And so she had her own masjid where she would give lessons in fiqh and in hadith and in Islamic sciences, and her lectures were attended by hundreds of people. And Imam Shafi'i took a lot of hadith from her. And when Imam Shafi'i was dying, she sponsored Imam Shafi'i's education when he was in Cairo. And when he was passing away, he said he wanted to be taken to the house of Sayyidah Nafisa so she could pray for him before he was buried. And so when he passed away, he was taken to Sayyidah Nafisa's house. And then she prayed for him, and then he was taken off to be buried. And her niece, Sayyidah Aisha, whose mosque is not far from my house as well, was similar to her in that respect. And then we see Fatima Fihriya, who established the oldest university in the world and the oldest continually running university in the world and a masjid, as well as her sister Maryam, who also established Masjid al-Andalus in I think it's called Masjid al-Andalus in Fez. Both of them built masjids, and they were, scholars, and they helped promote and establish scholarship within the region. And across North Africa, we see these kind of women. In Mauritania, the same thing. We have loads of female scholars who are very well known. And then in Senegal, in Mali, in northern Nigeria, the same tradition continues. So we see, for example, the daughters of Sheikh Ahmad Bamba, the mother of Sheikh Ahmad Bamba, even in Senegal, and his grandmother were both scholars who were experts in Quran, memorization, and Maliki fiqh. So it's said that Sheikh Ahmad Bamba's mother, before she married his father, 50 people had memorized the Quran from her. And she was an expert in Mukhtasar Khalil, which is one of the highest texts of Maliki fiqh. In northern Nigeria, we see Uthman Danfodio's daughter, Nana Asma'u, is an accomplished scholar and author, and somebody who started a social movement called Antaru, which traveled across northern Nigeria, establishing schools for female scholars who, when they graduated, were given permission to open their own schools. So it started a chain of, female scholarship across the region. And we see the same thing in Senegal with the daughters of Sheikh Ahmad Bamba, the daughters of Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, many of whom were married into communities outside of Senegal, such as in Nigeria, in Niger, in Sierra Leone, in Mali, in Mauritania, and even in America. So in the article, for example, I mentioned Sheikh Maryam, who has a Quran school in Senegal that, people from across West Africa come and study at her school. Tens and thousands of children have memorized the Quran there. And her sister, Sayda Khairi, who lives in Niger and who established an NGO that has now 200,000 members that establish, schools, clinics, hospitals, healthcare programs, entrepreneurship traineeships programs, microfinance schemes to help female entrepreneurs, etc. But even just recently, I was in Senegal and I was talking to a daughter of Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, who's called Maryam as well. And she was named after, well, she's not named after her older sister, but she has the same name as her older sister. And she lives in New York. So she was a nurse. She memorized the Quran at the age of 13 or 14. And then she studied French and English. She was living in Sierra Leone for a while, and then she traveled to New York, and she started working in New York as a nurse. So she's a nurse, but she opened a Quran school in her house, and children in her neighborhood, I think in the Bronx, study the Quran from her and memorize the Quran from her. And so she continued that same tradition of Quran memorization and scholarship, just in a completely different context and in a completely different continent. And she has another sister, Safia, who was in America, has now returned to Senegal, but she had opened a Quran school for memorization of the Quran in Las Vegas. So we see, that unbroken chain of knowledge and transmission, as anyone who's memorized the Quran had memorized it from someone who memorized it from someone who, all the way back to the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ, and through its establishment in West Africa and the importance of female scholarship in West Africa, we see these female scholars who, in new globalized contexts as economic migrants in America, are still continuing that tradition that their fathers and their elder sisters established in West Africa of opening Quran schools so that children can memorize the Quran and they can pass on knowledge. And so, the article is there. The lecture is also there. It's called Daughters of Fatima. So if you Google it, there's a Crowdcast link where you'll be able to watch it. And the information that's in that lecture will also be included in my book. And there's the article on Sacred Footsteps as well to check out, inshallah.
Inshallah, yeah, definitely. We'll put the link to that article in the show notes as well. And it's it's amazing how you articulated some of the stories that unfortunately, it's sort of whitewashed in a more essentially male-dominated society. We sort of lose we don't hear about these sort of stories, which is unfortunate. So, alhamdulillah, someone like yourself is actually bringing these works to light. I also wanted to ask, in terms of when it comes to slightly different topic, but when it comes to Islam in Senegal, there is some interesting history, because you mentioned Shaykh Ahmad Bamba, and from what I know, he was the one that started the rise of the Mouridia movement, and there's also the Tijaniya movement by Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse. I just wanted to ask, like, from your perspective, just I guess in a brief manner, because we can kind of go, this is like another podcast in of itself in this question, but can you maybe explain why these movements occurred and the context of why these movements arose in the first place?
Okay, so historically, if we look at these movements, they are in their origin Sufi tariqas. So they're turuq, meaning paths or spiritual brotherhoods. And tasawwuf, Sufism, as we know, is a part of the sciences of Islam. As to go into it will be a whole other podcaster. But Islam, essentially, as we know from the hadith of Jibril, consists of Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. Islam, as described by the Prophet ﷺ, is completion of the 5 pillars. So we can say that's everything to do with outward knowledge or physical activity, and that's for the body. And then when we look at Iman, it's to do with belief, and so defining who Allah is, who the prophets are, what the books are, who the angels are, what the day of judgment is, etc. Those are all mental concepts, and so that's for the mind. And then we see ihsan, and ta'abudullah ka'annaka tarahu, fa in lam takun tarahu fa innahu yarak. The Prophet ﷺ said it's to worship Allah as if you see him, and if you do not see him, you know that he sees you. And this third science, the science of ihsan, is what the scholars preserved and turned into tasawwuf, the same way the first level of knowledge was turned into fiqh or sharia, and the second was turned into aqidah or ilm al-kalam, etc. And then we see the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ being preserved in hadith. We see the style of recitation of the Quran being preserved in tajweed. So all of these sciences were realities at the time of the Prophet ﷺ that were then codified and made into religious sciences by the people who came after them. So the science of spirituality within Islam, the science of purification of the nafs, because the Prophet ﷺ said, there's a piece of meat in the body that if it's good, then the whole body is good, and if it's bad, the whole body is bad, and that is the heart. And Allah says in the Quran, يَوْمُ لَا يَنْفَعَ الْمَالُ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. On the day where children and wealth will not benefit anyone, but the only thing that will benefit them is if they have a pure heart. Or when Allah says, وَالنَّفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَاهَا. By the nafs and the one who formed it, meaning he's swearing on the nafs and he's swearing on himself. The nafs being the human ego, or the soul, or the spirit, not the spirit, but the soul or the ego of the human being, and the one who created it. فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا, and taught it right and wrong. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَاهَا. The person who purifies it is successful. وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَاهَا. And whoever does not purify their nafs has failed. The science of purification of the nafs and the science of worshipping Allah as if you can see him, and the science of essentially arriving to yaqeen, ilm al-yaqeen or ayn al-yaqeen, true knowledge of Allah, is known as the science of tasawwuf. And the ulama of this science, the scholars of this science, all have different methodologies or ways to attain this spiritual reality. And so the ways and the paths that they have, which are all, mustamid, like they're taken from the Quran and the Sunnah in terms of daily recitations of the Quran, daily awrad, dhikr that you're supposed to do. The different methodologies they developed were then named after them. So we see, for example, Tariqatul Qadiriyah, the Qadiri path, named after Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jailani. We see Tariqatul Shadiliyah, the path of Abu Hassan al-Shadili. We see then Tariqatul Tijaniyah, the path of Shaykh Ahmad al-Tijani. And so the ulama of West Africa, when studying, they study fiqh and they choose a scholar to follow in fiqh, mostly Imam al-Malik. When they study aqidah, they choose a scholar to follow in Aqidah, mostly Imam al-Ashari. And through Imam al-Ashari within his school, the most popular text of Aqidah, for example, West Africa, is the text of Imam al-Sunusi. And then when it came to Ihsan, the most popular paths in West Africa were the Qadiri path of Abdul Qadir Jailani, and then at a later time, the Tijani path of Shaykh Ahmad Tijani, who was an Algerian scholar, alim, descendant of the Prophet ﷺ, who migrated to Morocco after going on Hajj and passing through Egypt and various countries, and then settled in Morocco in Fez. And so his masjid, his zawiya, is built in Fez, and he's buried in Fez. And so his spiritual path was a path that was taken by the ulama of Senegal. Now, in terms of the popularity and its widespreadness, we see, specifically speaking about the Senegambian context, during colonization, the kingdoms that used to exist, such as Kayor, Bawol, Siin, Salum, Jollof, etc., were destroyed by the French. And so people who once had kings and leaders, community leaders in the forms of royal families, had to now turn to scholars to replace them. And so we start to see, for example, Tiwawun becomes the center of the Tijani Tariqa, and the Si family, under the guidance of Alhaji Malik Si, replaced the rulers of that area, which was Kajor. No, not Kajor. Jurbel. No, not even Jurbel. I forgot the name of what that area was called, the kingdom it was before. But now we see, for example, the capital of the Tijani Tariqa in Senegal was Tiwawun. We see in Bawol and in Jurbel, the kingdoms that existed before were replaced by the authority of Sheikh Ahmad Bamba and the family of Sheikh Ahmad Bamba. And so people looking for guidance, looking for leadership, when they no longer saw their kings, they went to their scholars. And so the scholars then had an amazing influence over the formulation of society and how society was run. And these scholars were practitioners of tasawwuf. And so we start to see, for example, tariqas become popular in the past 200 years in Senegal specifically, due to the fact that colonizers had destroyed everything else. And so the scholars were the last refuge for people, as they trusted them and they placed their trust with them. And the same thing in Mali, we see many of the scholars were Qadiri, and so we see the Qadiri Tariqa popular in Mali, the Tijani Tariqa also. And in northern Nigeria, the Qadiris and the Tijanis, as Shaykh Usman Danfodio, who started the Sokoto Khilafah, which was the Khilafah that ruled northern Nigeria and still exists till today. Northern Nigeria, about 14 states in the north, ruled by Sharia law and are under the command of emirs, who are descendants of the emirs that were appointed by the Sultan of Sokoto, Usman Danfodio. He was a Qadiri. And so most of these kings traditionally were Qadiri in Tariqa, and the ulama in their courts as well were Qadiri in Tariqa. And then when the Tijani Tariqa came and started to spread, before the time of Sheikh Ibrahim Niass and during the time of Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, many of these emirs, most specifically the Emir of Kano, became Tijani and were supporters of Tijani ulama, Tijani zawiyas, or headquarters of Sufi brotherhoods, etc. So that's more the context of how it spread in West Africa specifically. It was during the colonial time, the fact that most of the ulama were practitioners, and then people sought new authority in the ulama after colonization had removed, royal families and royalty from these areas. People who went to ulama ended up becoming Sufi because the ulama were Sufi. And they ended up becoming members of these tariqas because they gave their allegiance to the scholars who were Sheikh Murabbi, who were, sheikhs who were given authority in spiritual instruction via the methods of these tariqas.
That is so fascinating. I was just thinking, specifically with my next question, I think will address this. But what I've been getting so far in listening to you and in this episode in general is that there is so much of this history that we don't know about, and there are quite large barriers in accessing this history in terms of the lack of resources available to us. Even a simple Google search will just lead us directly to like if I'm searching for prominent Black Muslim figures in history, the top 3 results will be Malcolm X, Bilal radiallahu anhu, and Muhammad Ali. It's very disappointing, very disappointing. So what would be some good places to start looking and learning more? Because I think this would be extremely beneficial, not only to us, but as a source for Black Muslim youth, especially to find their stories that will strongly resonate with them.
I hate to feel like I'm self-promoting, but literally my book is coming out and I feel like that would be a resource. And there's also there's a lot of work. As you said, it's very difficult to find access, but the knowledge is out there. So I would recommend looking up people like Mohammed Adeyinka Mendes, as I mentioned earlier. Habib Akande has some amazing books. Abdullah Hakim Quick, Professor Rudolph Ware. These are the main scholars I feel who are pushing this narrative forward and trying to make this information available. And yeah, I have a reading list on Sacred Footsteps that I'll send you the link for. You can include it, I think, in the description of 11 books about the history of Islam in West Africa. There are many books coming out, and there are many books already there. The books on the list are very good books. And even though the resources are limited, if you master the resources that are there already, you'll have a nice foundation to continue research and continue looking for more information. And possibly even, the next person who's going to translate text or write books or create a new lecture series might be listening to this podcast right now and be inspired to do something. So I feel like nobody should feel as if they're too small to make a contribution, because I literally just, by accident made a presentation and presented it one day, and that turned into this whole movement, which is sparking, conversations across the world and doing a lot of major things. So you're never too small to make a difference. And you have to be the change you want to see. If you don't see something present within the community or within society that you feel should be there, you should be the one to do it. Maybe that's a sign of Allah showing you that you're the one that's meant to bring about that change.
That's a very valid point. And that's great that we've already got a starting point, and inshallah, we can inspire that kind of action. That'd be so important. Moving forward, in terms of that and keeping in with that same theme, what would be some practical tips that we can implement through Islamic curriculums, whether it be through schools, colleges, institutions that are run through the community, that we can try to integrate this knowledge of Islamic history so that it is no longer forgotten? What do you think needs to happen for it to occur?
I feel like the research that I've brought through Beyond Bilal and some other scholars have developed curriculums, etc., inspired by Beyond Bilal after me. So, for example, Rudolph Ware, as I mentioned earlier, with a few other scholars such as Shaykh Aisha Prime, developed a curriculum that they were offering to, I think, schools and Islamic institutions. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but if you go to any of their social media pages, you should be able to find it. And if you look at it, it's exactly what I spoke about in Beyond Bilal. Like, it's 4 parts, and the 4 parts that they speak about were what I covered a year or 2 before through my Beyond Bilal and before Malcolm X presentations. So this knowledge is available, and there are curriculums being developed. Professor Sheikh Mohammed Adeyinka Mendes is also developing one. And as I mentioned earlier, the book is coming out. The Beyond Bilal book is coming out this year as well. All of these, and they're books that have already been translated. So Ibn Jawzi's book, Tanwir al-Ghabbash, has been translated. Imam Suyuti's book is currently being translated. It was commissioned by Mohammed Adeyinka Mendes. All of these books together, when you add them to the already Islamic curriculums, they will be able to make a difference, a really huge difference in providing this knowledge and making this knowledge accessible, inshallah.
Inshallah. I also wanted to sort of, I guess, the last topic that I did want to essentially cover today is, I know you've done talks on Mansa Musa, for example. I know, I guess we have spoken about racism that exists and the deeper sort of people and scholars that existed in Africa and the movements there and all that sort of stuff. But I also wanted to take a sort of different, maybe potentially critical approach, because we may have heard, and maybe others haven't, about heard about Mansa Musa, where he was one of the richest. He probably was the richest man actually in history, in human history. At the same time, maybe you can kind of give a quick overview of who he is, that sort of thing. But after you've done that, I wanted to also ask and get you to answer that some people, they, like, in this day and age, we see capitalism and we see exploitation of the rich. And so I guess the question would also be that amount of wealth that he accumulated, wouldn't that have only been through potentially oppressive means? So for example, the people have, I think even scholars that have researched into Mansa Musa have noted that he had extremely high taxes that he put onto his people, and that's how the wealth came about, and that's how, and that's essentially trying to argue the fact that what he was doing was oppressive, even though as Muslims, because many Muslims aren't aware of him, and when they hear about him, they're just like, oh, mashallah, he's a Muslim, and he's from Africa, and he was black, and he was also rich, and they cheer about it, which is great. But at the same time, he may have not been that sort of perfect kind of figure that we describe him to be. But maybe you have a different opinion. I don't know. I'm just sort of laying out my thoughts, but I wanted to, sorry, I think it's a bit of a long question. Like, number one is just kind of a small overview of, a short overview of who Mansa Musa is, and also may have accumulated his wealth through oppressive means.
Yeah, so essentially Mansa Musa was the emperor of the Mali Empire, and the Mali Empire came about when a man called Sunjata Keita, who was the son of a tribal chief in Mali. Mali was a small kingdom before it became an empire, and it was a small kingdom that was a subsidiary of the Ghana Empire before it. And when the Ghana Empire crumbled, many different kingdoms emerged, and Sunjata Keita was the one who organized and conquered 12 kingdoms and united them. So he made a federation of a few kingdoms, and then he conquered a few other kingdoms, and essentially they all came together as an empire under Sunjata, who was known as the original Lion King of Africa. And so after Sunjata, his younger brother Manding Bori Keita took over. He didn't take over directly, but Sunjata didn't leave an heir that could take over. So Manding Bori Keita, and Manding Bori Keita's grandson was Mansa Musa. So Mansa Musa essentially was the great grandnephew of the original founder of the Mali Empire. And so he grew up, he was Muslim. Either his father or his grandfather his grandfather, Ili, I think his name was Ili, who was the first king of Mali actually to go on Hajj, converted to Islam. And then, he inherited Islam from his grandfather. And he grew up, from the accounts that we have of him, he was very knowledgeable. He spoke Arabic. He was dedicated to recitation of the Quran and his Salah and Maliki fiqh. He had a deep, in-depth knowledge of Maliki fiqh, according to the Emir of Cairo, who hosted him on his way to Hajj. So essentially, in summary, that's who he was. And he became the king of the Mali Empire, actually, when his older brother, Mansa Abu Bakr, abdicated and left him in charge of the Mali Empire as he set off on a mission with 2,000 boats filled with men and 1,000 boats filled with resources to cross the Atlantic. And so many people propose that he actually did arrive in the Atlantic, and this was in the early 1300s. He arrived, in the Americas before Columbus. And so, there's a lot of evidence, and I talk about that in my lecture before Malcolm X. So that's essentially who Mansa Musa was. And in terms of his wealth being being coming from oppressive means. That's if you look at it in a 21st century context, and even if we look at the mess that is modern day politics, if we look at what's happening in the Middle East right now, if we look at some of the contracts some of our governments have been signing, etc., we can see that oppression is never really done. But if you look at a 13th century king who was the grandson of a warlord that united a kingdom and established his empire through war and federations, then yeah, it's easy to say he was oppressive and he gathered his money through oppression, because there's no such thing as democracy in those days. There was no such thing as, an electoral system. There was no, it was kill or be killed, take over or be taken over. It was empire. It was warfare. It wasn't the comfort that we live in now and the political context that we live in now. And so I feel like we have this tendency, especially when we study, in modern institutions, and we have all these different ideas, to look at people historically in our current lens. So we're looking at Mansa Musa in the lens of a 21st century, millennial context. If we look at it through this context, then it can be, you can call it whatever you want to call it, essentially, because it doesn't fit our standards of taxation, our standards of how a society should be run, our political and economic processes, and the ideals that we've created for ourselves in the past 100 years. But traditionally, a king, when you take over a land, you are in charge of the land and everything on the land, and that belongs to you. So you can do whatever you want in your empire because the empire is your personal property. That was how rule was established in those days, and I feel like judging Mansa Musa by our modern day context would be unfair. He was a king who, he's very controversial up until today even. So for example, in Mali, certain griots and tribes do not like Mansa Musa. He's not this celebrated or revered figure in West Africa as he is outside of West Africa. So, everyone according to their own sensibilities and the way they want to judge him. But not only was he a wealthy man, he was a patron of the arts. He was somebody that invested a lot in the development of his people, in establishing universities, in building mosques, in building centers of learning, in giving out in charity, in doing a lot of things that benefited Mali short term and long term. And so, if we look at the fact that he gathered all this wealth and he, did all of these things, what better alternative was there for them at that time? And what could he have done differently? And how could he have done things in a better way? Because if he didn't do things the way he did, we wouldn't be here in 2020 talking about him. So, yeah, it's a touchy subject, but, each to their own interpretation, inshallah.
Yeah, it's a sort of conversation to be had, because it's interesting that you brought up the kind of realigning of our perspective, in the sense that we have to take into consideration the context of that time, and essentially, especially in an age of empires, at that time, I assume as well that Mansa Musa had an immense army to protect them, and how else would you have managed to establish a army that can protect its people and also at the same time provide centers of learning and stuff without high taxation? Like, these are, I guess, questions to be had, and I'm not saying I have all the answers but all that, but it's just an interesting discussion in of itself. I guess as well,
that's what research is for. So now that the question is out there, if we're not the ones to research it, then hopefully someone listening can research it and make
exactly,
some headway, inshallah. But that's the beauty of the time we live in. It's a time where we can investigate the past, and we can, discover new information, and we can reinterpret historical narratives, and we can add more depth and insight to them. So it's all good, alhamdulillah.
Definitely. And essentially, I also wanted to ask in terms of his, I guess, inclinations in a more spiritual sense. Would you say he was? Would you say in general, because it seems to be that, or maybe I'm butchering this, is that actually I probably am like the West African scholars you mentioned, and the movements there are more Sufi aligned. So would you say even potentially, someone like Mansa Musa was of that kind of spiritual Sufi inclination? At the same time, would you say that Sufism in of itself was just always there, always existed way before? Maybe at times we have a more, I know I'm throwing terms out there now, but the more let's just say hard-lined approach that we have some people take in this day and age when it comes to Islam and Sharia, for example.
Yeah, I would definitely say Mansa Musa was probably mutasawwif. And the only reason I would say that is because the Emir of Cairo, when describing him, said that he was somebody who behaved as if Allah was in front of him and he was looking at him. Meaning he was somebody who the Emir of Cairo considered to be in the state of ihsan, that he worshipped Allah as if he could see him. And he mentioned him being dedicated to his Quran, recitation of the Quran, and nawafil prayers, so he used to pray extra prayers during the night, and adhkar wal awrad, and he used to recite a lot of dhikr and a lot of awrad. And all of these are characteristics of the mutasawwifin, they're characteristics of the people of tasawwuf. But in terms of tasawwuf being a reality that's always there, I've just recently purchased a book called Hilyatul Awliya, and it was essentially one of the most important sources for the early development of Sufism. And it was a book. It was a book of ahadith as well. So it was compiled by a scholar called Abu Nu'aym al-Isfahani. And what's interesting about it is it's called Hilyat al-Awliya wa Tabaqat al-Asfiya. So it was him compiling the biographies of different awliya, different saints, and the foundations of the Sufi path, essentially. And it starts with Sayyidina Abu Bakr, and then it goes into Sayyidina Umar, Sayyidina Usman, Sayyidina Ali, but speaking about them more from their spiritual aspect and their spiritual practices and their zuhud and their tasawwuf. And then it goes through all of the major figures of the Salaf as-Salih. So the first three generations of Islam, before going into the more popular scholars that we now know today as Sufis. But this essentially demonstrates that tasawwuf is something that has always existed in Islam from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And people who incline to extra ibadah, people who incline to zuhud, people meaning abstention from the world, physically and spiritually, people who inclined to spiritual practices, etc., they were all described as being Sufis or mutasawwifin. And so if we look at books like Hilyatul Awliya, the fact that it starts with many of the major Sahaba and then many of the Tabi'een and then the Tabi'een and then, the scholars of the Khalaf and the Salaf, it shows you that this is something that's always been there. So, before the formation of Turuq, before the formation of, tariqas as we know them today and Sufism as we know it today, if we look at tasawwuf in its original context, what it's supposed to be, the spiritual practice of Islam, the striving for ihsan, the purification of the nafs, the worship of Allah according to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, the hadith Qudsi narrated through the Prophet ﷺ, where Allah said, "The servant does not draw near to me with anything more beloved than what I have made obligatory upon them, except nawafil al-khair, extra good deeds. And when he continues to do those extra good deeds, he will continue to do so until I love him. And when I love him or her, I become the eye with which they see and the ear with which they hear and the hand with which they hold and the foot with which they walk. And if they were to seek refuge in me, I will protect them. And if they were to ask me of anything, I would give it to them." That is tasawwuf. That is the spiritual path. It's establishing your fara'id and then approaching Allah, seeking a means to Him, as the Quran says, "Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ittaqullaha wabtaghu ilayhi wasila." Seek a means to arrive to the Allah or to arrive in the presence of Allah through nawafil al-khair, extra good deeds, which are prescribed to you by somebody who has arrived which is, a Shaykh, Murabbi, etc., until you yourself arrive to the state where Allah loves you and He becomes the hand with which you hold and the eye with which you see and the ear with which you hear. And in that state, you can then truly worship Allah as if you see Him. Because if Allah becomes the eye with which you see, when you worship Allah in that state, you're worshipping Allah as if you see Him. Or at least if you can't see Him, you know that He sees you. And this is all within the Quran, within the Sunnah, and within the practice of the Salaf al-Salih and the Khalaf. So people just need to reinterpret the way they see history and the way they see Islam and the way they interpret these or define these Islamic sciences. But yeah, long story short, Mansa Musa was spiritually inclined according to what we know about him, inshallah.
Mashallah, that was beautifully articulated, and I think in this episode we've covered so much ground, alhamdulillah, and I really hope that the audience benefits from it. All types of ways of looking at Africa and racism, and we talked about Sufism and all that sort of stuff as well. But I also wanted to ask a last final question, which we asked to all our guests on the show. So if you had to chill with, and I suspect that this question will be very hard for you, especially the sort of research and lectures that you give on these sort of topics, but if you had to chill with three people in a cave, who would they be? It could be anyone from the past or even the present, but it can't be Rasulullah or some of the Sahaba, because everyone's going to pick them anyway, and we want sort of diverse answers. So we'll just assume they're all in the cave chilling, like the prophets and the Sahaba and stuff, and you just have to pick three more people to chill with. They can be anyone currently living or anyone from the past as well.
Definitely for me, two of them would be, just off the bat, Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse and Sheikh Hassan Cisse. Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, just because, giant of, to talk about Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, that's a whole other podcast. And then Sheikh Hassan Cisse, because that's Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse's grandson and his successor, the inheritor of his secret, and it's through him that I became Muslim, and through him that I kind of entered the spiritual path, but I never actually had the chance to physically meet him. So I would have loved to actually meet him, chill with him, spend time with him, ask him questions, get guidance from him. That would be something amazing. And then the third
I've actually watched your interview on, I think you did an interview with, I just wanted to quickly add, because I think you did an interview about your sort of conversion story, and I think you sent emails as well.
Yeah. We emailed each other, spoke to each other on the phone. But I was very young. I was 13, and I didn't have the time to visit him and sit with him and benefit from him, properly in his time. As when my time began, his time was coming to an end. I met him in 2007, and then he passed away in 2008. So that would be someone I would love to be in the cave with, him and his grandfather, Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse. And the third person, just because of the context of what we're talking about, would be Mansa Abu Bakr, Mansa Musa's older brother, just to see if he actually made it to the other side of the Atlantic or not. And if he did, what happened when he got there. Yeah. Those would be my three people.
Subhanallah, because the video, or I think the interview that you did where you talked about your conversion story, like subhanallah, that's even mind blowing in of itself. And I think you suspected that the Shaykh, because the Shaykh would get like so many emails, I think you said that you suspect that he had some sort of foresight in some way where he dedicated, because a lot of people would say like you have some important emails, like why exhaust time and energy into a 13-year-old or however you were old at that time, and responding to their sort of email. But I think you alluded to the fact that you suspected that he may have seen something, in the sense that, for example, the sort of lecture series that you're doing and mashallah providing a lot of benefit, he may have had some sort of foresight. That's just kind of my own theory, but you know what I mean? So
yeah, that's
busy.
That's what his secretary told me, because his secretary was the one that used to type the emails for him. And I met him when I traveled to Nigeria in 2018. Was it 2018? Yeah, 2018, because I just got married. Yeah. And he was the one that brought all the emails out, because I had lost them, but he had saved them on his computer, because yeah, it's a long story, but basically he had saved all of the email correspondence between me and Sheikh Hassan on his laptop. And he was the one, he said, I always used to wonder why Sheikh Hassan used to spend so much time on you, and he was so insistent on responding to your emails when he was receiving hundreds of emails from way more important people. He said, but now that I'm seeing the work that you're doing, I can see that he probably knew that this was going to be the benefit of you coming to join the deen. And
Subhanallah,
so,
subhanallah.
I mean, I hope, inshallah, that I can live to fulfill the secretary's good opinion of me. And, like Sayyidina Abu Bakr said, oh Allah, forgive me. Oh Allah, make me better than they think of me, and forgive me for what you actually know of me. Inshallah.
Inshallah. Yeah, like, especially with the sort of content that you're producing and the sort of discussions and the lecture series that you're doing, there's so much more to be discussed. And I guess at the end of the day, it's about making people aware from an educational point of view, because Ryma may have alluded to a way, essentially, in this day and age, we just sort of go about schooling system and go to university. We're sort of fed to us or spoon-fed to us a certain narrative, and now we have to, as the youth that are mashallah living in more privileged places or rungs of society, we have to now do a lot of the legwork when it comes to disseminating this kind of knowledge. It doesn't necessarily have to be specifically about racism or African history per se. It could be anything in particular that we feel that is haqq or truth, and that needs to be shown to the masses more. It could even stem from Islamophobia, all that sort of stuff. So mashallah, you're covering a really important topic and area of study that needs to really be discussed more. So I hope we can, continue the discussion further. And it was really an honor to have you on the show, because I've been following your content for some time. I've been watching Baraka Boy since like episode 1 for a long time. So, alhamdulillah. So, Jazakallah khair for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed your time as well.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair for having me, man. I've never done a podcast this long. It's like 2 hours, 20 minutes. But,
yeah, apologies. I hope you didn't feel like 2 hours there.
Alhamdulillah, it was a pleasure to speak to you and to speak to Ryma today as well. And just thank you for inviting me, giving the platform, giving me the opportunity, asking me interesting questions. Because this is my passion. This is what I love to talk about. This is what I love to discuss. And so if other people, alhamdulillah, find that interesting, find that beneficial, then it's always a pleasure to meet with you guys and speak to you guys and share what I've been able to gather with you guys, inshallah, and get your insights and your opinions to help improve the work that I'm doing. And also just your positive energy, man, and your love and your prayers. Everything is appreciated. Everything is appreciated. Jazakumullah khair.
For sure. We'll probably wrap it up there, inshallah. So for our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you have any questions or queries, feel free to email us at info@boysinthecave.com, and you can follow us on Facebook, and you can follow our journey through Instagram. Please leave a 5-star rating on iTunes, as that greatly helps us. And you can also support our project through Patreon. So if you check out patreon.com/boysinthecave, if you become part of the $5 tier, you can inshallah join our WhatsApp group. We have these sort of discussions and other discussions around other topics as well, with guests that have been on the show. So you can definitely check us out there. So for our special guests, Mustafa Briggs, my co-host Ryma, and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum.